Alright, next finished new project. This is an MTH Mohawk. It is a 482 locomotive, and this one came from the MTH warehouse sale as a unfinished product. So the casing was not painted, the tender was not painted, it had no boards inside, and it had no motor. Which sometimes isn't a problem on a Mohawk, it is. So on a typical MTH chassis, you have a motor with a flywheel on the back. The flywheel is a weight so that when you start the motor, it's like a slow start and a slow stop, nice and smooth. And the motor just has this gear on the end that connects straight to the rear drive wheel. A Mohawk doesn't do that. The Mohawk has a band that runs around the top of the DC can motor, and then has this little plastic piece about this long with tabs that stick out either end, a little wishbone, and that connects into the drive. The drive looks like this. This sits down in the chassis with a bushing on this end, and this little end has got a place for the wishbone to sit in. So this was missing out of my Mohawk. MTH Parts and Sales have this. They don't have any more of the motor because the motor also has that coupling on the end. So I bought a standard little DC can motor at a hobby shop, but the shaft is much smaller than the shaft that this little coupling goes into. So what I ended up doing was drilling a hole in a brass screw that is tiny bit smaller than this shaft on the motor. Then heating the brass screw up till it expanded, and then tapping that on the end of the shaft, cutting it off, and then holding the motor in a vise, connecting this to a DC power pack, and spinning it like it's its own little lathe until I worked the new brass screw down till it was just a tiny bit bigger than the hole on this little coupling. Took an extra one of these, heated it up, coupling came off the end, and then got it onto my new brass. So I don't have the flywheel counterweight on the back. I could have bought one, but I didn't even know if this was going to work. So put this new one in, added this into the Mohawk, put my little dog ear coupling between, and lo and behold, everything came together to make the locomotive run. So this was custom paint. I painted it flat black, masked off the front, added this beautiful Rust-Oleum satin nickel spray. I used rubber stamps that I already had. So the 3250 came off an Ives locomotive, and then the New York Central lines came off of like early Lionel passenger coaches. But just like everything else, DC can motor doesn't run on AC track. So there's a tether that runs between the tender and the locomotive. This locomotive doesn't run if it's not connected to the tender. So in the tender, there's a bridge rectifier. So AC connects to two of the four poles. It switches it over so the other poles come out DC. And the underneath, there's a little switch, just like the early ones that let me run forward. If I push it backwards, it runs in reverse. But you can manually change directions. For my locomotive and the layout I run, that's just fine. So right now I think I've got it in forward. You can see we had power. I love the linkage on this. Pulls really well. It's got firebox glow. We hooked that light back up. And even though it was an unfinished kit, it did come with all the railings and pieces and bells, steam whistles. It just needed its finish. So if we flip the switch underneath, Very simple. It's just a little flip switch. I even have it wired so that when it goes in reverse, the light on the back of the tender lights up just like it would in a real locomotive. But when this thing goes into forward and we flip the switch the other direction, which takes 2 hands, sorry. Now it's in forward. It goes around the track. That light isn't on the back of the tender. And you can see, because it doesn't have the flywheel, it doesn't do a slow stop. When you turn off the power, it just stops. And sometimes it'll slide on the track a little bit. So if I want to, we can take the motor out, get one with a flywheel, and then repeat the whole process of turning the little brass screw down to fit that. But honestly, it runs really, really well. And for what I do on my layout, I think it's just fine. So these unfinished MTH, everything that's coming out of the warehouse sale, like, I don't think I'll buy one without a motor again. It's just a little bit of a pain. And for what I do, I don't need all the boards and the sound effects and everything else on some of them, but for pulling a locomotive and changing directions, you know, not bad. I think I've spent $35-40 on this. So, and then the parts from MTH. So for about $50, a running, driving Mohawk. Really cool linkage, you know, nice rubber stamps, came out looking really well. So my MTH unfinished product Mohawk locomotive.